To start off with my bias, I love the movie Encanto, and even my predisposition is I wanted to love it because I'm Colombian American. I was dying to show it to my kids years before the fact when I first heard that Lin-Manuel Miranda was working on Colombian music for a Disney animated feature. My kids and I are really enjoying all the memes and just the cultural juggernaut that this thing has become. And so I am definitely in a celebratory mood about it. But at the risk of being pedantic, I'm going to pick on something that's driving me crazy in so many of the articles and chatter about this movie. Encanto is not magical realism. And yet it seems very few writers can resist claiming that it is. Even the filmmakers make that claim. They're wrong, but they make the claim, and that doesn't mean they didn't make a great movie, because I think they did. And don't worry, we will keep it light. Let's put Encanto up to the test. We have to figure out what magical realism is in order to do that. That's not easy, but we'll do it quickly. And let's throw in some other movies for comparison's sake and be able to walk away after just a few minutes knowing how to spot actual magical realism. And I just think this is in keeping with the spirit of my channel, because if there's one thing I do, it's cover things that practically nobody else seems to. So the only question I could find on all of YouTube about whether or not Encanto is magical realism was put out when there was just a trailer. Kudos then to Story Dive for at least putting that to the test. Meanwhile, if you Google "is Encanto magical realism," Google or YouTube, in neither source do you get even one specific response. So it seems like nobody's asking that question, which blows my mind. And it doesn't take any of the enjoyment out of the movie to wonder that. Instead, what you get are 1,000 variations of claiming that it is without backing that up at all. Granted, this is not really an article, just a Reddit post, but it claims that the movie is a classic magical realism movie. No. Even if you want to make the argument that it's magical realist, it's definitely not classic textbook. Super quick condensed history. It was in 1925 that a German art critic coined the term magical realism, and he was talking about graphic art painting, and the kind of paintings he was seeing there in the early 20th century were a rejection of this kind of a thing, Romanticism. This is a work by William Blake, of course, and that itself was a rejection of basically the Enlightenment, rationalism, that kind of a thing, and instead an embrace of the personal, the emotional, and the imaginative. Even the irrational, but it didn't all have to be dark and disturbing. It could be warm and gauzy. After all, it's romanticizing something, right? So while Blake might have wanted to highlight our dark inner selves and the things we don't want to talk about, another romantic painter could show something like this, looking back to stories from before the Age of Reason, and celebrating how life was once something that didn't involve quantifying and classifying everything. It's basically like if people who are way too into the Renaissance Fair took over the art world. But it was complicated because I just mean this piece here that we were covering, not the William Blake stuff, and not something like this, which is also a romantic work. But regardless, there came a counter-movement, as there almost always does. And it had the very unoriginal title of realism. I guess you'd say unimaginative, which kind of makes sense if the movement is one that's rejecting another movement that's based on celebrating imagination. I guess you'd want to go with a very literal title. And as you can see with this painting, the focus is on reality, even the mundane. Remember that for later. And the whole point of this is only that magical realism is, look for the underlined sentence here, this comes from the masterclass folks, a part of the realism genre. And that is really important. It's not just that this genre is not full-fledged fantasy, which is basically what most people say or imply. Not being 100% fantasy is not enough. Hey, Salman Rushdie is a super smart guy and maybe the most famous user of magical realism, brilliant writer. What did he say? Quote, "When people use the term magic realism, usually they only mean magic, and they don't hear realism." I'm going to skip to the end of his statement. It's the surrealism that arises out of the real. That last sentence is dead on. Let's quote some other experts. Matthew Stretcher says it is, quote, "what happens when a highly detailed, realistic setting is invaded by something too strange to believe," end quote. A perfect bullseye from him as well. Both writers touch on what is to me the indispensable quality of this genre. Let's talk about Harry Potter. Because if you didn't take those very specific, precise definitions or descriptions and instead use the more general ones that you find, these also being the ones that are used to justify Encanto counting, well then Harry Potter would have to count as well. What the Encanto filmmakers and others talk about is how the magic has to be grounded in something real. Real emotions, real character development, and especially in the case of this movie, and I think this was done very well, trauma. And everybody agrees that if anything is going to count any movie or book, then it has to be set in the real world. But back to Harry Potter, those books and movies hit every one of those marks, right? Harry is being raised in the real, mundane world in a nice, normal house. Well, it wasn't very nice for him living there, but you get the point. The wizarding world is hidden within our world, and it intrudes upon the story, right? The trauma of losing his parents. The way so many of the magical adventures and developments he goes through are obviously metaphors for real-life situations growing up. For a deeper callback, exactly the way that in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, everything Sarah Michelle Gellar's character was going through, all the adventures, the outrageous supernatural stuff, was all metaphorical for very concrete real-world issues. And speaking of the real world, she and the Scooby Gang live in it. She goes to a real, normal high school, not Monster High. And despite all of that, she doesn't count any more than Harry Potter does. And by the way, I just touched on some of my favorite books of all time, the Harry Potter books, and one of my favorite television shows of all time, so I am not being prejudicial here. They're great, they're just not magical realism, and here's how to kind of easily be able to tell the difference. Without deep diving on books and academic papers and dueling scholarly opinions, Byzantine terminology, and the like, let's take the train scene in the first Harry Potter movie. Hey, they're in a real train station, like an actual train station you can go to, right? And it's not full of wizarding stuff, that's just one tiny little slice in there. So does this count? No. A very easy way to tell. It just gets started, and the first muggles to see Hagrid gawk at him. Also, the conductor that Harry asks for help doesn't understand and thinks it's a joke when Harry asks for help getting to platform 9 3/4. And importantly, it's very obvious that if any of the Muggles, this conductor included, actually followed Harry to that platform, they would lose their rhymes with skit. The Muggles seem oblivious to the magical folk running through the brick pillar and, into it. If any of them had noticed it, they would have had the same reaction. Even our protagonist Harry, who now knows about magic and this whole amazing world, he knows his mother and father were magical. He's on his way to wizarding boarding school, and even he is astounded by what he's seeing and doing. And that's part of what makes this fantasy. Unlike the genre whose name I'm trying not to say a million times throughout this video. It's also called marvelous realism. I'll start using that for a change-up. Here's a definition of it from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Chiefly Latin American narrative strategy, hence why everyone insists on associating Encanto with it. That is characterized by the matter-of-fact inclusion of fantastic or mythical elements into seemingly realistic fiction. The Madrigal family and their amazing casita, they are not included matter-of-factly in the story. No, it's literally a miracle that causes them to be what they are. That's the express opposite of, let's say, marvelous realism. Anyone outside of the Madrigal's, mystical, magically protected village would certainly freak out if they saw any of the amazing things we do, but even the townspeople do it to the ones who live there and don't have powers. When everybody enters Antonio's room for the first time, nobody just goes, meh, okay, a impossibly super giant self-contained jungle in a bedroom. One character instantly remarks, it's bigger on the inside. Doctor Who reference probably? In the opening number, which I've heard many, many times with my kids, and I enjoyed each time, it's obvious that the village children are amazed by the Madrigal family. They insist Mirabel list everybody in the family and what they can do. What are the superpowers? And as I said, even the superheroes themselves understand this is extraordinary. So as if I haven't pile-drived at this point home over and over again, how the characters react to whatever the magic is of critical importance to whether or not the story counts. And it has to be the opposite of what we see here. For instance, let's look at the movie Edward Scissorhands. Not the most textbook case you could find, but still way closer to the mark than Encanto. Johnny Depp's character shows up, and nobody acts like it's the most bizarre thing they've ever seen in their life that this guy has scissors instead of fingers. He just gets going cutting people's hair and trimming hedges. And he is the outlier in a purposefully mundane world. Everyone in this cookie-cutter suburb has no frame of reference for understanding what in the world Edward Scissorhands actually is. Again, he's the outlier. This is a normal world. It's a satirized normal world, a satirized suburb, but that's the setting of the movie. The movie is not set in a fantastical world where there's a different freak show in each house. Pan's Labyrinth, brilliant movie, often listed as a work of, let's say, magic realism this time, and I like that it's by Del Toro, so it has that Latino connection because, of course, it's obligatory to point out Latin America is the place that made this genre famous. And this is a better movie than Shape of Water. But anyway, Pan's Labyrinth, there's fantastical creatures and a fantastical world that our protagonist, the girl, kind of an Alice in Wonderland-like figure, gets dragged into. But whenever she's there, she takes it in stride, even though she lives very much in our world. And clearly, the things she's going through there, and what that country is going through there, notice the fascist uniforms in the back, is part of what's reflected through the magical adventures. The fantastical stuff is used metaphorically, but that's not the defining characteristic. Again, that's not enough. And most of you, unless you watch my channel, most of you probably don't know who Alejandro Jodorowsky is, legendary cult filmmaker, but his semi-recent movie, The Dance of Reality, is a much better example than anything else we've talked about so far. This autobiographical movie is set in the real world, in the town where he grew up in Chile, but his real-life story is told in a fabulous manner so that occasionally, but not overwhelmingly at all, occasionally, strange things happen that are impossible and everybody treats them as if they're normal. Alejandro, a child at the time, and his mother miss the dad, who has disappeared on a quixotic quest. She holds a stone, tells him to spit on it, he does. She ties it to these balloons, and it flies away. It floats across the country and just happens to hover over the exact spot where he's living, this shantytown here, and the rock just happens to break free of its bonds at that moment, land on the roof of the shed that he's in, wake him up, and make him remember who he is, because he was suffering from amnesia at the time. That is the heart of magic realism. It's just a touch or some occasional touches set in a very realistic world. There's no explanation whatsoever for why that worked. It absolutely shouldn't, and neither we nor the characters should care. We spend, 85% of this movie seeing the explicable, and occasionally we deal with the inexplicable. So no, it doesn't matter that Encanto is set in Colombia, where the signature work, literary work of this genre was written. It doesn't matter that it purposefully mirrors the plot of that book in some ways, which as a Colombian American I think is fantastic that they did that. It doesn't matter that, in the words of one of the directors, quote, "It's not just an easy answer to your problems." Speaking of the magic, sorry. It's actually a reflection of the experiences you have every day, whether you're enjoying success or struggling, end quote. Wonderful. Has nothing to do with the subject at hand, but wonderful. It doesn't matter that Mirabel's mother's arepas heal you, physically heal you, in the way that a mother wants to protect her young and nourish them and heal them when they're sick. That's great. It's excellent storytelling. It's just not you-know-what. Now, to be fair, this category is a fungible one. It's difficult to pin down. People have had trouble with it ever since it started being a thing. But for all the dueling definitions and overlapping parameters, if you know it, then you know it when you see it, and you know when you don't see it. Speaking one last time about being able to easily identify that which we will not name, imagine if the arepas in this movie, if you saw how they were made. I mean, the laborious, boring, detailed, real-world way that they are made. If you are steeped in that by the film, and then somebody has a terrible accident, and then Julieta, Miraba's mother, hands them an arepa, not to heal them, just gives them an arepa, they eat it, are instantly, supernaturally healed, and nobody acts like that's unusual. Now that would count. So once again, I do love the movie, and it's not that it doesn't have some elements from this genre in it, it does, but it actually violates the basic tenets throughout the whole movie and in its overall construction. So that's what makes slapping that label on it so lazy and incorrect. Finally, the movie does take a different approach to magic because of where they set it, and I think it's wonderful that they took the trouble to do that, and that actually worked. It just taps into a different kind of magical thinking and storytelling popular in the Latin psyche than the one everyone claims it does. Well, I am, true story, gonna go eat some arepas now. Bye.